You know what's absolutely wild? During World War II, thousands of German soldiers were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to prison camps in Canada, and when the war finally ended, a huge number of them actually begged to stay. Not just a few dozen guys who fell in love with a local girl or something. We're talking about thousands of prisoners of war who fought tooth and nail to never go back to Germany. Some of them literally cried when they were told they had to leave. Now I know what you're thinking. This has to be propaganda, right? Like some kind of wartime feel-good story that got blown out of proportion. But here's the thing. This actually happened, and the reasons why are so fascinating and so unexpected that it completely changes how you think about World War II. So what made Canada so special that enemy soldiers preferred captivity there over freedom in their homeland? The answer involves lumber camps in the wilderness, German POWs eating better than Canadian civilians, a secret operation to reprogram Nazi minds, and one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in military history that almost nobody talks about. And by the end of this, you're going to understand why some historians argue that what happened in these Canadian camps might have actually helped prevent World War III. Let's go back to 1940. The war is tearing Europe apart. Britain is standing alone against the Nazi war machine, and they've got a massive problem that nobody really anticipated. They're capturing German soldiers faster than they can build camps to hold them. After Dunkirk, after the Battle of Britain, after every naval engagement in the Atlantic, more and more German POWs are flooding into an already crowded island that's struggling to feed its own population. Britain is literally running out of space, running out of food, and running out of guards to watch these prisoners. So Winston Churchill makes a decision. He's going to ship thousands of German POWs across the Atlantic to Canada. Now Canada wasn't exactly thrilled about this at first. They're already sending hundreds of thousands of their own men overseas to fight. Their economy is completely geared toward the war effort. And now Britain wants them to babysit thousands of enemy soldiers. But Canada agrees, and in the summer of 1940, the first ships packed with German prisoners start arriving in Halifax and Quebec. These men had no idea where they were going. Many of them thought they were being taken to England. Some thought they were heading to Australia. The journey across the Atlantic took weeks, crammed below deck in converted cargo ships, wondering if a German U-boat might accidentally torpedo them without knowing German POWs were aboard. When they finally arrived in Canada, most of these men expected the worst. They'd been fed Nazi propaganda for years about how the Allies were barbaric, how they tortured prisoners, how being captured meant almost certain death. The hardcore Nazis among them had convinced others that they were probably going to be executed or worked to death in some frozen wasteland. And to be fair, Canada did send them to some pretty remote locations. Camps were built in places like Alberta, Ontario, and New Brunswick. Some were so far from civilization that escape would have been suicide even if you made it past the fences. We're talking about wilderness where you could walk for days without seeing another human being, where winter temperatures could drop to 40 below zero. But then something unexpected started happening. These prisoners arrived at camps and found heated barracks, not luxury accommodations by any means, but solid wooden buildings with real beds, blankets, and stoves. They were given 3 meals a day, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because of how Canada's agricultural system was set up, and the fact that they weren't dealing with the same supply shortages as Europe, these German POWs were often eating better than German civilians back home. Sometimes they were eating better than Canadian civilians. There are documented cases of Canadian guards looking at prisoner meals and being genuinely jealous. The POWs were getting meat regularly, fresh vegetables when available, bread that wasn't stretched with sawdust or substitute ingredients. One German prisoner later wrote in his memoir that the first real meal he had in the Canadian camp made him break down crying. Not because it was fancy. It was just basic food, prepared decently, in portions that actually filled him up. He said he hadn't eaten like that since before the war started. Another prisoner described the psychological shock of realizing that the guards weren't going to beat them, that the camp commandant actually cared about the Geneva Convention, and that they were being treated like human beings instead of subhuman enemies. But it wasn't just about the food and shelter. Canada did something really smart that most other countries didn't think to do. They put these prisoners to work, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of forcing them into pointless labor or dangerous conditions, Canada integrated them into the actual economy in ways that benefited everyone. Thousands of German POWs were sent to logging camps in Ontario and Quebec. Canada desperately needed lumber for the war effort, for construction, for paper, for a million different things. And these logging camps were so remote and the work was so specialized that there was actually a labor shortage. So German prisoners, many of whom had no logging experience whatsoever, were taught how to safely cut timber. They were given proper equipment, trained by experienced Canadian lumberjacks, and paid a small wage for their work. And here's what's crazy. These men started taking pride in it. There are accounts of German POWs competing with each other to see who could cut the most timber, who could do the cleanest work. They started learning French and English from the Canadian supervisors. They'd sing German folk songs while working, and gradually the Canadians working alongside them started joining in, teaching them Canadian songs in return. This wasn't supposed to happen. These were enemy soldiers. But somehow out there in the wilderness, cutting trees side by side, something shifted. Other prisoners were assigned to farms. Canadian farmers were desperate for help because so many young Canadian men had enlisted. So German POWs were sent out in small groups to help with harvests, with planting, with taking care of livestock. And this is where things got really complicated in the best possible way. These prisoners were living on farms, eating meals with farming families, playing with their kids. One farmer's wife in Ontario later recalled how strange it was at first, having these young German soldiers at her dinner table. Her own son was overseas fighting against Germany, and here she was passing potatoes to a man who days ago might have been shooting at Allied troops. But she said after a few weeks, she stopped seeing the uniform and just saw a scared kid who missed his own family. There's this one story that really captures what was happening. A German prisoner named Friedrich was assigned to a farm in rural Saskatchewan. He'd been a dedicated Nazi Party member, truly believed in Hitler's vision, volunteered for military service. But the family he was assigned to had a young daughter, maybe 8 years old, who was terrified of him at first. Friedrich went out of his way to be gentle around her. He'd carve little wooden toys during his free time and leave them where she'd find them. After a few months, this little girl who'd been taught to fear Germans started saving part of her dessert to share with him. Her father, who'd initially wanted nothing to do with having a German prisoner on his property, later said that Friedrich became like part of the family. When the war ended and Friedrich had to go back to Germany, the little girl cried for days. Now multiply that story by thousands, tens of thousands of individual human connections happening across Canada. German prisoners teaching Canadian kids how to play German card games. Canadian families inviting prisoners to church services. Small towns organizing Christmas celebrations where POWs and locals celebrated together. This wasn't official policy. It just organically happened because when you force people to actually interact as humans instead of as enemies, something fundamental changes. But the Canadian government noticed this was happening, and instead of shutting it down, they leaned into it. This is where things get really fascinating from a psychological and historical perspective. Canadian military intelligence had been studying these prisoners, trying to understand who they were, and they realized something crucial. The German military wasn't some monolithic block of fanatical Nazis. It was complicated. Sure, there were die-hard Nazis among the prisoners. Members of the SS, true believers who would never change their minds. But there were also conscripts who never believed in Hitler in the first place. There were guys who joined the military because they had no choice. There were former communists and social democrats who'd been swept up in the general mobilization. There were Austrian prisoners who resented being part of Germany at all. There were teenagers who'd been brainwashed by Nazi education but didn't really understand what they believed. So Canada started an experimental program. They began separating prisoners based on their political reliability. The hardcore Nazis were sent to specific camps with maximum security and minimal privileges. But the prisoners who seemed open to change, who showed signs of rejecting Nazi ideology, they were given opportunities. Educational programs were set up. German-speaking instructors, many of them German refugees who'd fled the Nazi regime, were brought in to teach these prisoners about actual German history, about democracy, about what had really happened during the war. They showed them documentary footage of concentration camps. They gave them access to uncensored newspapers and books. At first, a lot of prisoners didn't believe it. They thought the concentration camp footage was Allied propaganda, fake images designed to demonize Germany. But as more evidence piled up, as they heard testimony from other German prisoners who'd been part of these operations, as they read accounts from multiple sources, something started to crack. There's a recorded interview with a former German POW who described the moment he realized everything he'd believed was a lie. He said it felt like the ground disappeared beneath him. His entire worldview, everything he'd fought for, all the friends who died, it was all based on monstrous evil. He said he seriously considered suicide because he couldn't handle the guilt and shame. But the Canadian program didn't just destroy their old beliefs and leave them broken. That was the genius of it. They also gave these men tools to rebuild. They offered vocational training. Prisoners could learn trades like carpentry, mechanics, electrical work. They could take correspondence courses. Some prisoners actually earned university credits while in captivity. The Canadian government was essentially preparing these men to go back to Germany and become productive citizens, instead of bitter veterans who might fuel the next war. There were also cultural programs. Prisoners formed orchestras and theater groups. They put on performances that Canadian civilians would attend. One camp in Alberta had a prisoner who'd been a semi-professional opera singer before the war, and he organized full opera productions with elaborate costumes made from whatever materials they could scrounge up. Canadian newspapers covered these performances. Local people bought tickets, and the money raised went to Canadian war charities. Think about that. German prisoners of war performing German opera to raise money for the Allied war effort, and doing it voluntarily. Sports were huge too. The camps organized soccer leagues, and these games became major events. Canadian Guards would form their own teams and play against the prisoners. Sometimes local town teams would come challenge the POW teams. There are photos from these matches, and if you didn't know the context, you just think it was a regular small-town sports league. Guys laughing, shaking hands, arguing over calls. The war feels a million miles away in these images. But it wasn't all peaceful coexistence. There was real tension too. Remember, not all the prisoners bought into this. The Nazi loyalists in the camps tried to maintain discipline, to punish anyone who got too friendly with the Canadians. There were secret courts where hardcore Nazis would put other prisoners on trial for betraying the fatherland. Some prisoners who became too cooperative were beaten by their fellow POWs. A few were even murdered. Canada had to constantly shuffle prisoners around, trying to separate the violent extremists from the men who just wanted to survive and go home. And then there were escape attempts. Not as many as you might think, considering we're talking about thousands of prisoners over several years, but they did happen. Most were half-hearted attempts that ended within hours. Because where exactly were you going to go? You're in the middle of Canada, you probably don't speak English or French well. You have no money, no papers, and the nearest German-controlled territory is across an ocean. A few prisoners made it surprisingly far. One guy made it all the way to British Columbia before getting caught. Another lived in the woods for months before finally turning himself in because he was starving. But here's the thing. As the war dragged on, escape attempts became less about actually getting back to Germany and more about maintaining honor. Some prisoners felt they had a duty to at least try, to show they were still soldiers. But when they were inevitably recaptured, many seemed almost relieved. Because the truth was, life in the Canadian camps was better than what waited for them back home. News was filtering through about what was happening in Germany. The Allied bombing campaign was turning German cities into rubble. The Eastern Front was collapsing into chaos. Millions were dying. Families were starving. And these prisoners in Canada were safe, fed, and learning useful skills. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, a lot of the German POWs in Canada thought they'd be shipped home immediately. But that didn't happen. Europe was absolutely devastated. There was no infrastructure, no functioning economy. Germany itself was divided into occupation zones, and the Allies were struggling to figure out what to do with millions of displaced people and former soldiers. So the German POWs stayed in Canada. Months turned into years. They kept working in the lumber camps, on the farms, in various labor programs. And the longer they stayed, the deeper their roots grew. By 1946, something remarkable started happening. Prisoners were writing letters to the Canadian government begging to be allowed to stay permanently. They'd petitioned their camp commanders, asking if there was any way they could immigrate to Canada instead of being repatriated to Germany. Some had fallen in love with Canadian women and wanted to get married. Others just felt like they'd found a home. The idea of going back to the rubble and chaos of post-war Germany versus staying in a country where they'd been treated well, where they'd built relationships, where they had job skills and opportunities, it wasn't even a close call for a lot of these men. The Canadian government was actually in a tricky position. On one hand, there was public pressure to send these enemy soldiers home. Canadian families had lost sons and husbands fighting against Germany. The idea of letting German soldiers stay and become citizens seemed like a betrayal to some. But on the other hand, Canada needed immigrants. The country was huge and underpopulated. They needed workers for the post-war boom. And these German POWs had already been vetted. They'd been living in Canada for years. Many spoke English or French. They had job skills, and they'd proven they could integrate into Canadian society. Starting in 1946, Canada began allowing some former POWs to apply for landed immigrant status. Not the hardcore Nazis. They were shipped back to Germany to face whatever justice awaited them. But the prisoners who'd gone through the re-education programs, who demonstrated they'd rejected Nazi ideology, who had clean records in the camps, they were given a chance. It wasn't automatic. They had to apply, go through interviews, prove they had job prospects. But thousands did, and thousands were accepted. This created some wild situations. Former German soldiers who'd been enemies of Canada a few years earlier were now officially becoming Canadians. They were settling in the same towns where they'd been prisoners. They were marrying Canadian women, raising families, opening businesses. That farmer in Saskatchewan whose daughter had befriended the prisoner Friedrich. Friedrich ended up staying. He married a local girl, took over a farm of his own, and became a respected member of the community. When he died decades later, his obituary mentioned his service in the German military, but focused mostly on his 40 years as a Canadian farmer and his contributions to the local church. There were thousands of stories like that. German POWs who became Canadian citizens, who sent their kids to Canadian schools, who lived quiet, productive lives and rarely talked about their past. Some went to extraordinary lengths to give back to the country that had shown them mercy. There's a story about a former POW who became a successful businessman in Ontario and anonymously donated huge amounts of money to Canadian veteran organizations. When his identity was eventually revealed, he said he could never repay the debt he owed to Canada for saving him from becoming what the Nazis wanted him to be. The psychological impact of this experience can't be overstated. These men had been prepared by Nazi propaganda to expect torture and death if captured. Instead, they found humanity. They'd been taught that other races and nationalities were inferior. Instead, they formed genuine friendships with people from all backgrounds. They'd been told that might makes right and that compassion was weakness. Instead, they experienced firsthand how treating people with dignity and respect could transform enemies into neighbors. Some of the German POWs who returned to Germany after the war carried these lessons with them. They became part of the generation that rebuilt West Germany into a democratic, prosperous nation. Several former Canadian POWs went into politics and education in Germany, and they credited their time in Canada with teaching them what real democracy looked like. One former prisoner became a mayor of a small German town and established a sister city relationship with the Canadian town where he'd been held. He'd organize exchange programs where German and Canadian kids would visit each other's countries, explicitly to build the kind of understanding that he'd experienced as a POW. Now you might be wondering, why did this work so well in Canada when other countries didn't have the same success? Part of it was practical. Canada had the space, the resources, and the economic need for labor. They could afford to treat prisoners relatively well because they weren't starving themselves. But it was more than that. There was a deliberate policy decision to see these prisoners as people first and enemies second. To recognize that most of them were victims of Nazi ideology rather than its architects, and to invest in the long game of turning potential future threats into allies. Compare this to what happened with German POWs in other places. The Soviets held millions of German prisoners, and their experience was horrific. They were used as slave labor in brutal conditions. Hundreds of thousands died from starvation, disease, and mistreatment. The last German POWs didn't return from the Soviet Union until the mid-1950s, and those who survived came back broken. Britain treated their German prisoners reasonably well, but they didn't have the resources for extensive rehabilitation programs. The United States had similar programs to Canada, but on a smaller scale and with less success, partly because the distances and logistics were harder to manage. There's a case to be made that what Canada did with their German POWs represented one of the most successful de-radicalization and rehabilitation programs in modern history. They took young men who'd been indoctrinated into one of the most evil ideologies ever conceived, and through a combination of decent treatment, education, meaningful work, and human connection, they fundamentally changed how these men saw the world. Not all of them. Some remained committed Nazis until they died. But enough of them changed that it made a real difference. And here's something most people don't realize. The lessons learned from the Canadian POW program influenced how Western countries approached de-radicalization for decades afterward. When you look at modern programs trying to rehabilitate former terrorists or extremists, a lot of the techniques can be traced back to what Canada figured out during World War II. The emphasis on education, on vocational training, on providing alternative identities and purposes, on showing empathy while still maintaining security, all of that came from those wilderness camps in Ontario and Alberta. There's also a darker side to this story that's worth mentioning. Not all Canadians were happy about how the German POWs were treated. Some thought they were being coddled, while Canadian soldiers were dying overseas. There were protests in some towns when locals found out prisoners were getting meat rations that civilians couldn't access. A few camp guards were investigated for being too friendly with prisoners. And after the war, there was definitely resentment when former POWs were allowed to stay. Some Canadians felt betrayed, like their sacrifices had been meaningless if the enemy soldiers got to just become Canadians. These tensions were real and valid. War is complicated and messy, and there's no clean answer to how you should treat enemy prisoners, especially when your own people are suffering. The Canadian government had to walk a fine line between maintaining security and morale, while also pursuing what they believed was a smarter long-term strategy. They didn't always get it right. There were instances of prisoners being mistreated by guards. There were administrative failures that left some prisoners in harsh conditions longer than necessary. It wasn't a perfect system. But what makes the Canadian POW story so compelling is that despite all the complications and moral ambiguities, it mostly worked. It worked in ways that nobody really expected. It showed that even in the middle of the worst war in human history, there was room for compassion and forward thinking. That treating your enemies with basic human dignity wasn't just morally right, it was strategically smart. Because those enemies might become your neighbors, your friends, your fellow citizens someday. When you look at old photographs from these camps, what's striking is how ordinary everything looks. You see young men smiling, playing cards, working, living. You see Canadian guards and German prisoners standing together, not with the tension you'd expect, but with the casual familiarity of coworkers or teammates. You see prisoners in Christmas pageants, in soccer uniforms, in graduation ceremonies for vocational programs. These could be photos from any small Canadian town in the 1940s, except for the context that makes them extraordinary. The last German POWs left Canada in 1947, though by then, thousands had already secured permission to stay. In the decades that followed, many of the men who'd been prisoners in Canada would bring their families back to visit. They'd show their children and grandchildren the camps where they'd been held, the farms where they'd worked, the towns where they'd discovered what it meant to be treated like a human being instead of a monster. Some of these visits turned into emotional reunions with the Canadian families who'd befriended them during the war. Old men who'd once been enemies would embrace, sharing memories of a bizarre chapter in history where the world was at war, but they'd somehow found peace in the Canadian wilderness. There are only a handful of these men still alive today. They're in their late 90s or over 100 years old, but their stories live on in their families, in local histories, in the archives of those prison camps that have long since been dismantled. And their legacy is this strange, hopeful footnote to World War II. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, even when countries were locked in total war, even when propaganda painted the enemy as irredeemably evil, there was still space for connection and transformation. So when you ask why German POWs loved being captured in Canada, the answer isn't simple. It wasn't just about the food or the safety or the humane treatment, though those things mattered. It was about being given a chance to be more than what the Nazis told them they were. It was about discovering that the world was bigger and more complicated than the propaganda. It was about forming relationships that transcended nationality and ideology. It was about being seen as a person with potential, instead of just an enemy to be destroyed. And maybe most importantly, it was about hope. These men had been part of a regime that nearly destroyed Europe and murdered millions. They carried that weight, that guilt, that shame. But in Canada, they were given something unexpected. Not absolution, because what happened couldn't be forgiven that easily, but a path forward. A chance to build something better, to be part of creating a more peaceful world instead of a more violent one. For young men who'd expected to die on a battlefield or waste away in a prison camp, that chance at redemption was worth everything. That's why they begged to stay. That's why they cried when they had to leave. That's why so many of them spent the rest of their lives trying to live up to the grace they'd been shown. The story of German POWs in Canada isn't a clean, simple tale of good versus evil. It's messy and complicated, full of contradictions and difficult truths. But it's also a story about our capacity for change, about the power of treating people with dignity even when they don't deserve it, about how the choices we make in war can echo through generations in ways we never expect. And in a world that still struggles with how to break cycles of violence and hatred, that's a story worth remembering.